My name is Paul Grogan. I'm the president of the Boston Foundation, and it is a true delight to welcome all of you here this morning for this important forum. We have, as usual for these nonprofit forums, a terrific turnout, and I thank you all for coming. We hope to return the favor of your presence with a first-rate discussion. We've got some real superstars here this morning to talk with us about the issue of the day, so I think we'll all be very, very pleased at what unfolds. I see so many friends in the audience. I know that most of you are very familiar with the foundation, but we are Greater Boston's Community Foundation. We are celebrating our 90th birthday this year. We are one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country with assets of about $675 million. The Boston Foundation and its donors make grants of about $50 million a year, mostly to metropolitan area Boston nonprofit organizations. In addition to our grant making, as this forum indicates, we do a great deal of research and hold many public forums and seminars on issues and challenges facing the city and the region. And we don't think there's anything that is more important than the vitality of the nonprofit sector. The Boston Foundation probably has the broadest interests and funds more organizations than any charitable funder in New England. So it seemed to us quite appropriate that we take a deeper interest in the health of the overall sector. For many, many years, the Boston Foundation has believed that great things are achieved by healthy, vital, business-like organizations. It's very clear how important the nonprofit sector is to Massachusetts. The recent study released by Mass Inc. and funded in part by the Boston Foundation is sort of a stunning outline of just how many organizations, the economic impact, how crucial this whole sector is. And yet, until very, very recently, the nonprofit sector has really been underanalyzed, understudied, and I would say underappreciated. In contrast to the business sector, where there is a very, very highly evolved system of business schools and techniques of analysis, volumes and volumes that have been written about how to be successful in business, how to run for-profit businesses. The literature on nonprofits, though growing, is still minuscule in comparison. But it's a yeasty period in which the crossovers between business and nonprofit worlds are being increasingly recognized, and business analytics are increasingly being applied to the nonprofit sector. It's important to note that nonprofits are not businesses. In fact, they are more difficult to run than most businesses, but they need to be business-like. There is a great deal to be gained, we believe, by importing the perspectives, the techniques, the analysis that has been honed in the business sector to the nonprofit world, and that certainly will be a prominent theme this morning. And if we want to be successful, we have a tremendous obligation to run our organizations efficiently and powerfully to get the biggest results with the inherently scarce resources involved. In addition to these forums and seminars, and this is, I believe, is the third major forum we've had on the nonprofit sector this year, the Boston Foundation intends to continue to sponsor research into various aspects of the nonprofit sector. And we are also very interested in the nonprofit sector becoming more organized to advance its own interests more effectively and to build public understanding of the nonprofit sector, which is not where it should be. So we're very pleased to be working with a number of organizations, including Third Sector New England, on the whole issue of can the nonprofit sector in Massachusetts get better organized, and there's some promising developments there that we will be talking about with you as we go forward. To get us started this morning, it is a great personal pleasure for me to welcome to Boston an old friend of mine, Clara Miller, who for 25 years has been the president and CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund, a national financing organization that has provided over $100 million in capital to nonprofit organizations during her tenure. It was really one of the premier nonprofit organizations in the country. And Clara has a long list of involvements at the national level in terms of being on the Federal Reserve Advisory Board. She also is a graduate of Cornell University, the School of Architecture, and has completed the Institute for Nonprofit Management at Columbia University. But I think Clara is terrifically equipped from her national perspective, dealing with organizations all over the country, to get this discussion about linking money to mission started. Clara Miller.
My mother is also 90 years old, but she doesn't have the asset base that the Boston Foundation has, unfortunately, I guess. This year, no less. I'm just going to, oh, there it is. Okay, terrific. I'm just going to start off and just for context, provide you with who NFF is, and the only reason I'm showing you this slide is because when I'm talking and going through these slides, I'm talking from the point of view of a banker, of all things, even though, as Paul pointed out, I have no real formal banking training. I didn't start from that perspective. But in a way, that's given me a perspective that's even more important for this sector, where we are all called by some sort of mission or enthusiasm. And then we discover that we have to have business skills in order to make that mission real. So I'm offering essentially what amounts to 25 years of pattern recognition for the field. Not just, kind of prescriptive, but what is it that we need to know about business and about capitalization, as it were, to make our missions real? And one thing that NFF uses is, of course, a triangle. Everybody has a triangle. Even some major religions have a triangle. We're no different. We have one too. Ours is, we've got mission and program at the top, and we all can understand what that's all about. Capacity on one point, and, we're familiar with capacity building and all that. And then we have another leg, and it's called capital. And what we've discovered is most of what foundations and we and the field in general does is try to build capacity that vibrates between mission and program. But we're saying there's another point on this that's called capital. And each of these things exists in relationship to to the other. If you change one, you have impact on the other two. We used to call this the iron triangle. That sounded a little bit too much like a medieval torture device. So we kind of changed it to the thermodynamic triangle or something, where if you change one, the other two change in some relationship. When we talk about capital structure, which is, yuck, we have a definition. We say it's about the balance sheet of the organization, the distribution, the nature, the magnitude, the size of the asset base of the organization. And most of us don't really look at our balance sheets much, and if we do, we kind of hide our eyes and go back to other more interesting things. But let me give you an example so it illustrates what we mean by capital structure, what NFF means by capital structure. Okay, this is an audience participation quiz. We have 3 organizations here, and what you're looking at is bar graphs. And each of these bars represents a piece of the asset side of the balance sheet of an organization. The dark one is cash, the light gray one is receivables, the tall ones are plant and equipment, and the little one over on the right is other, investments in other. What's striking about these 3 organizations? Oh, come on, this is Boston. You guys are supposed to be smart. Yes, the plant and equipment dominates this balance sheet. So, what do you suppose these organizations might be? What
Museums and universities.
Museums.
Universities.
Very good guesses. One on the left is a performing arts center. The one on the right is a residential social services organization. And the one in the middle is, honest to God, Delta Airlines. Remember, these are percentages of the asset side of the balance sheet, not real numbers. what is their core business? Anybody take a guess at what do these organizations have in common that they have to do? Sell seats. Thank you very much. They all sell seats, and their balance sheets reflect that. In a sense, they're all in the same kind of core business, as we call it. So let's just look at another core business. This is what we have a core business that's called deploying people. On the left, education, workforce development. On the right, a traveling dance company owns no facility. In the middle, a counseling organization that does kind of after-school counseling in somebody else's space. What's striking about these organizations, or at least two of them? Cash dominates their balance sheet. It might be $34.29 in the case of the dance company, but nonetheless, they have to meet payroll. They're employing people. That dominates their operations. What's different about the middle one? It's dominated by receivables. That simply means that it has government contracts. But it's still in that business. Okay, so now what we say to ourselves is at NFF, we say that's what we call our core business, how we distinguish organizations that go across program type. Because there are all these program sectors, and generally we're thinking I'm in the arts, or I'm in social services, or I'm in community development. But in fact, the core businesses go across those sectors. They transcend those program types. So there are some parallels to business. So let's look at the business side for a moment. And here's another true-false quiz, although I've kind of modified it to say mostly true and mostly false, because there's always a lot of smart alecks in the audience and say, well, and because it's Boston, I can use the word fungible on this, and everybody will know what it means. This is about, for-profit business, money rules 101, generally speaking. Money is fungible, true or false? Very good. You can be Mrs. Miller's special helper, Paul. You got it. Price is determined by cost, consumer, competition. The consumer buys the product. Growth eventually increases profits, or the business fails and you go out of business. Investment in infrastructure is seen as necessary, and overhead's a regular cost of doing business. Profits drop to the bottom line and are used in the business typically to fund growth. Yes, A+ for this crew. So let's see, let's go over into our world for a moment, to the nonprofit world. Money is fungible all the time. False. Oh my God, yeah! We are in a different shadow universe. Even though there are business, we're little businesses in some ways, in these core operating ways, we have a very different kind of economic setup, as it were. There are reasons for that, but nonetheless it's true. So let's look at what else we face as managers of nonprofit businesses or nonprofit organizations. It's not enough that we take on businesses in that kind of climate, but we have here an example of how we create capital structures or develop capital structures according to some accounting rules that make our lives even more miserable. Across the bottom is something that I've called fixity of asset type, which is really an eye closer, I realize. But what it involves is varying levels of liquidity. As you go from left to right, start with cash, that's pretty liquid, and you get to a building, and that's pretty illiquid. It's just, but they're all assets. They would all appear on a balance sheet. And that's typical in for-profit businesses and nonprofit businesses alike. A building is more illiquid as an asset, or an airplane, than cash in the bank. But that's not enough for our sector. we actually have levels of restriction on cash. So if you go up the left-hand side, you see that, or on all assets, there's unrestricted assets, there are temporarily restricted assets, and there are permanently restricted assets. That kind of exists in some ways in the for-profit sector, but generally speaking, cash is cash and can be used as the primary hedge against risk. So what we essentially do with our money rules, unwittingly, for all kinds of good reasons, is that we create, in some cases, a state of super illiquidity. What might be up in that yellow golden box up there, permanently restricted buildings? You know, it would be a historic building. It would be a land trust. This is a hugely, this is an asset that typically can't be turned into income in the way that a typical one could on the for-profit side. And when we actually go out and raise money, what we find is the easiest money is the money that has the most impact on risk and liquidity in our organizations. In other words, it's easiest to raise money for new programs and expansion, but that draws on the other assets of the organizations and makes you more illiquid. It's easier to raise money for bricks and mortar than it is for a lot of things, but that, in a sense, also it makes your balance sheet more illiquid. It creates higher risk. Core operating costs, an eye closer for raising money. Very hard to raise, but extremely important as a hedge against risk and a management tool. And any for-profit business will tell you that. And finally, reserves, the biggest eye closer of them all. I have actually sat in front of funders and tried to raise money for a sinking fund for the buildings of boys and girls clubs, and I can tell you that is Death Valley from a fundraising perspective. But it's enormously important from a management perspective or from a business perspective. What we end up doing is driving funds toward higher illiquidity growth projects and away from the regular cash operating needs of organizations. We also have a very hard time growing in our just for straight-on business reasons. Let's just look at a facilities project as an example, and we're talking about how we allocate assets on the balance sheet as we go through phases of growth. What typically happens, and if there are funders in the audience who have received that panic-stricken phone call like, we've just finished the building and we're out of cash and we can't meet payroll, that's what this series of diagrams are about. Pre-project, this is a familiar-looking people deployment organization, and it's about to buy a building. It goes into just post-project, and what it has done is raised a whole load of cash and bought an asset, and that happens to be that high column of plant and equipment with that. And what that means typically is that you will reduce liquidity on that immediately. And what organizations have to do is to fight their way back to a new business equilibrium where they have enough cash to actually make those programs, make the promise of that new building real. The other thing that happens, in addition to that, when you change your asset allocation, as it were, is that you change your business. This organization that was really a people deployer has now become a seat seller. And it's a completely new management need. You have to do all the old things you had to do, and you also have to sell slots, sell seats. This could be a traveling dance company pre-project. It could be a resident dance company post-project with a school and with a theater. This could be a after-school program pre-project. It could be a education program with a building, and maybe even running a charter school after the project. And that makes life somewhat miserable for organizations that go through those projects. Or it just makes the management environment much more hazardous and much more difficult. I think that some of what Paul was referring to in his opening remarks was really the kind of head patting that goes on about management in the nonprofit world. It's a lot more difficult. The rules are very difficult. We're scaling organizations that do lose a buck on every widget. We don't exit from those businesses because of mission and passion. That's why we're here. But we have to have business rules that support those realities and not pretend they're any different. Growth is the key case of this. In for-profit growth, you eventually become profitable on a straight-on basis, just selling what you do, just doing what you do, generally speaking. And therefore, you have access to debt, retained earnings, issuance of equity, because you can make that promise to investors. You may not keep that promise, as we know, but you can at least make it because you know you're going to get more profitable as you grow. What happens in nonprofits is that we grow, and as we grow, we have to scale fundraising and other side businesses that are related and maybe a different form of sales, but that increase our need for money from the outside. We have contracts from the government that are often priced at marginal cost, and we have restricted grants that end up essentially requiring that we get more money because we're expanding the unprofitable part of our businesses as we grow. It's amazing any of us are still in business. Let's look at a case study we did. This is 25 years of financial history of the Steppenwolf Theater Company, which is about as good as it gets it's been profitable on an all-in basis all but 1 year of its 25-year history. 1977, John Malkovich, Gary Sinise, in the basement of Immaculate Conception Church in the suburbs of Chicago. And if you look at the first, 77 to 87, this is earned revenue and expense per artistic staff. They were pretty much profitable, or at least break even. Granted, their board members brought chairs to the basement of Immaculate Conception Church, not checkbooks. But they paid their way as they went. They were artistically remarkable. They needed a new theater, and that made their mission, broadcast of their mission possible. It brought all kinds of good things to the table. But it also brought something that was a structural deficit. In other words, what happens the minute they get their new building in 1989-90 is you open up this difference between revenue and expense per artistic staff. In other words, the artistic payroll does not earn its way because you essentially are paying all of the fixed costs of that building, which brings along with it all kinds of other benefits to your mission, without having adequate ticket revenue to cover the costs. And so what did Steppenwolf do about it? They grew their raised revenue as a percentage of the total. That's not the only strategy, but you have to do something like that to cover the requirements of nonprofit growth. Here we have the same 25 years, and their earned revenue, which was essentially dominated their revenue, their components of total revenue, little by little was almost matched 50-50 by raised revenue. In order to do this, what they ended up doing is, if you look at components of raised income, as they went through the same 25 years, individual contributions grew as a percentage of total over that period. And between 95 and 96, there was a huge jump. And what they did was to invest in their infrastructure. And what I mean by that is that their director didn't just add one person or two people to the development department. He added 12. That's what you had to do to get into that new market that included individual contributions. That's not the only strategy, but it's essentially a picture of how an organization that knows it loses a buck on every widget makes up for that and continues to be robust as it grows. Okay. We're all familiar with the with what we see when capitalization and business rules are ignored. There's all of the things that often folks are sent for management training on. You know, go and learn how to be a good manager. Go to Columbia Business School management classes. But it's not all fixable via that leg, that capacity building leg of the stool. It really needs both the capital side and the capacity side. Okay, I'm just going to quickly wrap up here. A few points. First group, little recognized in our world that capital structure even exists in nonprofits, and that it's related to, but it's different from the for-profit sector. It reflects a core business which is related to, but different from mission. When money goes into an organization, it goes into that business which supports the mission, but that's somewhat different from the mission itself, and we don't always make that distinction. That business type transcends the mission, and it reflects the program strategy, but it's not the same as it. And when we change the capital side of the triangle, there's an impact on the other two sides. In other words, you might have a positive impact on mission, but you need to build capacity to make sure you can use that new building, or you can use that endowment, or you can use whatever else you have done to kind of reallocate your assets. Second group of findings or thoughts, summary points. Program decisions do not equal business decisions, but they imply business decisions. And people, myself included, often make programmatic decisions without any sense of what it means from a business perspective. And that often undermines all of the good work that we do. We have to acknowledge that there is a core business under that program that behaves in a different way than just the straight-on program dollars as we look at them. Final 2 points. We create our own rules that in fact undermine management. When we make restricted grants, often that actually makes matters worse, not better. When we say, oh, you've got to grow, that always has a not negative effect, but it always has a financially challenging effect on a nonprofit organization. It's the opposite, in a way, for the long term from what happens in the for-profit world. Does that mean we shouldn't grow? Absolutely not. But it means that we have to understand and advocate for what it takes to grow the organizations that we run from a business point of view. When you're planning and funding an organization, know thy core business. Apply those money rules, understand the perverse realities of growth in our sector. We push ourselves to grow, and at the same time that makes it very difficult from a business point of view. And look at that whole triangle of capacity, mission, and capital as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara, for that terrific kickoff to this topic. Very, very thoughtful and provocative. And, you know, it occurred to me as I was listening to you that really the funder community, we really have to ask ourselves a simple question, I think, almost every day. And that question should be, what is the actual relationship between the way in which we are providing capital to the organizations we're supporting and what we really want them to do? And I think it is a question that is too infrequently asked, but this really helps us a great deal. Thank you, Clara. As I said earlier, we're now going to have, as we like to, a panel of practitioners to talk about some specific situations in light of the framework that Clara has given us. And we've got a real group of superstars. And to moderate this panel, we're very pleased to have George Overholser, who is the co-founder of North Hill Ventures, who is an expert in the relationship between capital structures and growth in the private sector. He's currently Senior Vice President and co-founder of North Hill Ventures and a member of Capital One Financial Corporation's founding management team. And during his tenure at Capital One, first as head of strategy and new business development and subsequently as founder of the venture capital operation, Capital One's earnings grew by over 20% a year and more than tenfold over a 10-year period. At the moment, he continues to serve as a part-time strategic advisor to Capital One and other for-profit growth companies, but he spends the balance of his time working to establish a capital market that serves the nonprofit sector. And that's a tall order, George, as you know. Prior to 1994, George was a principal at Mercer Management Consulting. He has a B.S. in physics from Harvard and an M.B.A. from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Please welcome George Overholser.
We might call up all the panelists now, and we're going to change over the format just a little bit. And I think I'll go sit over there. Before I introduce our panelists, I thought I'd tell a story of my own. Clara mentioned that you're not always the most popular person in the nonprofit world when talking about capital markets and financial matters. And I've learned that firsthand. I've now been at this for about 5 years, where I spend maybe about 80% of my time working in the nonprofit sector. But like many who are hitting the scene recently, I am someone who came from a business background. So a CEO of a local nonprofit that's been growing quite nicely had an idea. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I've got this important meeting with a new prospective funder who's a venture capitalist. So why don't I bring George along, and then those guys can kind of talk the lingo together. And he did bring me along, and it was a total disaster, complete and utter disaster. At the end of the meeting, this fellow, who was a very, very wealthy guy and philanthropically active, by the way, he leaned over to the CEO. He said, thank you very much, and thank you, George. But how about when you get this capital market stuff out of your system, why don't you come back then? It was a rather deflating experience. And at first, I was kind of distraught, because I knew in my heart how important this topic is, and I was thinking that you, sir, of all people, a venture capitalist who provides capital structures for for-profits, you, sir, of all people, should be sympathetic to this perspective and should respond to it. And I left the meeting feeling distraught. But then I had a bit of an insight, which I think is worth sharing with everyone here. And it happened when I was buying flowers for my mom, of all things. I went into the flower shop, and I thought, wow, what would it be like if the lady at the other end of the counter, instead of showing me these nice flowers I was going to send to my mom, pulled out her balance sheet and started going through line by line what her financial needs were in the flower shop, and described to me what the cost per petal was of the rose, and so on. And the answer is, it would have ruined my giving experience. And this is a real insight, because the truth is that even venture capitalists are looking for giving experiences with their philanthropy. They're not interested in solving financial problems. And when you think about it, the only reason that I and this nonprofit CEO even brought our financial problems to this fella is because we didn't have a bank to go to. And that's really the takeaway for me, is the lack of a banking infrastructure that is particularly good at serving the needs for nonprofits. And that's why I'm very delighted to be here today, and certainly to hear Clara's talk, because really organizations like Clara's are becoming the banking sector that serves this organization. And you can go have nerdy conversations with Clara Miller anytime, and she will love it. I've done it many times myself, late at night, over dessert, and then talk about giving experiences with the funders who are looking for that. So with that introduction, I thought I'd introduce our panelists just by name, and then I'd ask them each to say a little bit about their organizations. But we have here today Gerald Chertavian, Gail Lattimore, Earl Martin Phelan, and Valerie Wilder, each of whom has, of course, pulled together a case story that I hope you'll have a chance to read and enjoy as I have. And also, each of whom has been really quite thoughtful about managing this tension between money and mission. And why don't I just ask if you could each give a brief introduction to maybe what's behind the case story or anything you feel is germane. But one thing I would like to know is, talk about a moment when you said gulp. You know, when you were looking at that tension between money and mission, and you really had a challenge to work with. And maybe we'll just go on down the line.
Sounds good. Good morning.
Good morning.
See, I'm from this black church tradition of call and response, so when I give you the love of good morning, you have to give it back, so we start the day off right. So let's try it again. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, that's a lot better.
I've been trained over the years by Earl. It took 5 times.
First of all, I just want to thank Boston Foundation for organizing this session and for you to participating in what I think is a critical dialogue. To help set the context for Bell, I'll share a little bit about our history, mission, and vision, but first wanted to share a little quick story about Bell that I think captures the essence. Bell runs high-quality after-school and summer enrichment programs for elementary school children, and while our programs are focused really on helping children excel academically, it's really the core of our mission is to help children understand who they can become and then realize that dream. 2 weeks ago, we had a funder come out to visit one of our schools in Mattapan, over in Massachusetts, obviously, Mattapan Elementary School. And the funders shared kind of where they went to college and who they wanted to be when they were young and their aspirations and their dreams. And then we had our scholars do the same. And at the end of the talk, one of our 4th graders kind of raised her hand confidently and said, you know, one of our visitors, I jump back, one of our visitors actually was previously involved in television. So when our speakers finished, our 4th grader raised her hand and said, "Can you get me on television?" So let me digress for a second. We also have Bell has a neat partnership with the Boston Red Sox, where every year 25 of our 5th graders get a $5,000 college scholarship and mentoring from a mentor from Beth Israel Deaconess from 6th grade through college. So it's an incredibly powerful partnership. And Nesson invited us to come on the very next day after the site visit. Nesson invited us to come on and talk about this partnership. So we called up Adriana, our scholar, and had her come out and represent the organization. And so when she got the call after asking the question, she was understandably nervous about A, going on television, B, you're about 50 feet high above home plate looking down over the stadium, so she was nervous, afraid of heights. But she went out there and did this just absolutely incredible job, and just her energy and spirit when she finished that, and that's really the core essence of Bell. So I'll step back for a second. That probably sounded like a Nike commercial where you watch it. It's kind of entertaining, but you'd have no idea what the product is. So let me tell you what Bell's product is. Our mission, very straightforward. We run high-quality educational programs for elementary school children in low-income urban communities. Our mission is obviously to help children excel academically, but also to realize who they can become as human beings, as citizens, and as leaders within their community. Our history started actually as a community service project with a small group of black law students over at Harvard Law School. We just wanted to give back to the community. But I won't go into all the elements of our history, but some of the key lessons that are important for this conversation. One is we knew that the vast majority of children living in low-income urban communities lacked the basic skills that would allow them to realize their dreams. In fact, their education is pretty much subjugating them to a second-class citizenship. The second thing we knew, or that we believed, was that education was a key pathway up and out of poverty. We believe that all children deserved access to this high-quality education, to the opportunity to fulfill their dreams. And so we went out to build a program that would provide this opportunity for our scholars. It was also really important for us at the beginning to say there's a lot of statistics about, well, children come from single parents, or children come from poverty, or children come from, so they don't have the capability, they don't have the capacity to learn. So it was very important to us early on to say, we don't believe that. We believe all children can excel if given the right support, nurturing, love, and encouragement. And so we evaluated our programs really early on, and this is going to be important later. Just to give you couple quick data points from kind of what we found from our evaluation, first and foremost, during during the summertime, as I'm sure a lot of you who have children know, children across America lose about 1 month on average of reading, writing, and math skills. Well, children in low-income communities lose an average of 3 months reading, writing, and math skills. Our Bell Scholars for the past 5 years have gained an average of 6 months reading, writing, and math skills during our intensive 6-week summer program.
Yeah. Very scientifically measured, by the way.
Absolutely.
By his PhD wife.
Not married yet.
Oh, yeah, fiance.
Fiance. Who I work with, but that's another story. So there are other results to share. All 20 of our first class of scholars are currently in college, and that's compared to about 30 to 40% of children coming out of the Boston Public School who make it to college. So you have these great results. So I'm thinking, all right, we have these incredible results. Our visibility is increasing. Money's going to start flowing down to us like water off a cold Rocky Mountain. Yeah, right. It doesn't quite work that way. In 1999, we ran a $100,000 debt. In 2000, we ran a $200,000 debt. Now, how we stayed afloat during this period is a topic for another panel, but we'll get back to that. But there were 3 trends that were happening to us. One is our results were improving, and they were increasing each and every year. And this was, in fact, increasing demand for our program. More and more families wanted to join our program. We were also growing every year. So every year we were raising a little bit more philanthropically, and so we were able to serve more and more children every year. But we still had this demand that was going unmet. We had 3 children on our waiting list for every 1 child that we were able to serve. And so, in fact, our passion to serve more children and say we're going to find a way caused our deficit. And Ms. Miller spoke to us, but it caused our deficit to rise every year. And so this challenge, I guess this was the moment that we said gulp. 2 years, we had now a $300,000 deficit. We had a great program, but we didn't know how we were going to get out of it. So we actually stopped and stepped back with the help of New Profit Inc., with George, with Bridgespan and several others, and said, hey, we have to do a few things if we're really going to survive, if we're really going to fulfill our mission. The first thing was to stable ourselves economically, obviously. The second thing was to really understand our business model. The whole belief that, gosh, if we continue to run great programs and we prove it, that more and more money will come to us, it just really wasn't true. We were raising more money, but it wasn't at the pace we needed to, so we really needed to study our business model. For us, that became Title I funding under No Child Left Behind, which is now called Supplemental Education Services. So you've heard of, you may or may not have heard of Supplemental Education Services, but it's a federally funded program under the Bush administration that provides low-income families with a voucher. That's about $1,500, $2,000 in some states, where they can choose a approved provider to provide tutoring and after-school services. So we had to figure out our business model, figure out how things fit. The third thing was we had to leverage the capacity-building support that we've been getting, which would help us become more efficient, but B, we had to leverage our evaluation. The fact that we've been studying our program model for 6 years allowed us to figure out what levers we could pull to reduce the cost, but also increase the quality of our program, which was a real difficult battle for us. And then the fourth thing that we needed to do was we had to go out and get 2 types of funding. One was growth capital to help us to build the organization that would allow us to fulfill our mission, but the second was financing, because this government funding program that we were on is a reimbursement program. You start in October, you don't get paid till February. So we needed financing. Actually, we're very fortunate that the Nonprofit Finance Fund stepped up as one of our lead financing agencies that allowed us to grow. So a lot of other developments, but just to end very quickly, so what happened in the last year? A few things. One is we expanded in terms of entering a new region. So Bell is now in Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. We entered a 4th region, Maryland. Second thing that happened for us is we grew from 17 program sites, we're a school-based organization, 17 program sites to 35.
That would be a gulp.
Yes, that was a big gulp. Well, the other big gulp is our budget grew from $4 million last year to a little over $9 million this year. And we increased, most importantly, or the 2 most important final things, we increased our scholars served from 1,400 elementary school children last year to 4,400 scholars this year. And we're actually going to double our growth again in the coming year. And then, most importantly, our results have increased. So our outcomes for our scholars through all of this has increased. So I know I've gone over my few minutes, but I really look forward to continuing this conversation. I've come to believe there is no mission without the money.
Valerie, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Earl.
Thank you. Great, Earl. Well, thank you. Last night, as I was reflecting on today's seminar and looked at my colleagues' case studies, I could only conclude that I was invited here because you needed a before organization, and also so that I could provide some suspense, because I think the outcome for Boston Ballet is still somewhat uncertain, and I'm very happy to provide that service this morning. Boston Ballet's mission, as you can imagine, of course, revolves around dance, ballet, which means performing at the very highest standards of excellence possible, but also using the very particular attributes of dance to train, to educate, and to serve our community. And I guess I'll use an example, the way Earl did, to say that, for example, one of our programs called Adaptive Dance is designed with the help of Children's Hospital for children with Down syndrome. And as it happens, children with Down syndrome have very loose ligaments, which means that they have difficulty controlling their limbs, holding their heads up straight sometimes, and just looking normal, which makes them seem more disabled, in fact, than they are. Well, dance, as it happens, is very much about physical control, empowerment, and the changes in these children brings tears to your eyes, and their parents, of course, because by the time they've just had a very few weeks with us, they can hold their heads up straight, they can walk more or less normally, they can socialize with one another, and so it's that kind of almost kinesthetic knowledge that dance is able to transmit, and that's just one example of many of the programs that we have. The other thing about Boston Ballet is it is a resident company. That means that the 50 or more dancers, the 45 members of the orchestra, all the artisans, the technical people, and staff all live here and are part of this community, which means that when we do a very big production or one of our big educational programs, it's really embedded in the community, and it's quite this colossal, if you will, community endeavor. Of course, one of the most important contributions of an arts organization in a community is creativity, if you will, a little bit of risk-taking, in a way challenging, attempting the uncomfortable, attempting the things that have never been done before, and so that's always an element of what we do. I think the remarkable thing about the company's development over the years has been its ability to keep progressing artistically. It is just statistically, a few little statistics, it's about 42 years old, budget is a little over $20 million. It's the fourth largest ballet company in North America. It has by far the largest school in North America. We think possibly the world, but we don't say that because I keep thinking there's got to be a school in China somewhere that's bigger. but we don't, not to our knowledge. The thing about the company's development that it really has continued to really make huge strides, to the point that it is probably as high in the world of dance, in international recognition, as any arts organization in Boston. Meaning that where the MFA, for example, is on the firmament of museums around the world, and compared to, for example, the Louvre, Boston Ballet is in that same firmament compared to the Paris Opera Ballet. And so it really has, as the New York Times recently said, made mind-boggling advances for a company in a relatively small city. Of course, what my case study, if you get around to reading it, will show that at the same time, while there was some attention paid to what we're calling here capacity, the capital side was very much neglected, and so financial stability has been extremely elusive for the company. For a dance company, what we're calling here capital structure means all the same things that they mean to all of us here, and to business for that matter. But there are other issues of capital structure that are a little bit different, that you might not think of in that way. For example, productions. Unless you have productions that you are licensed, that the copyrights are up to date, that the sets and costumes are in reasonably good condition, you actually don't have anything to put on the stage. Similarly, people, the artists, to do the work, we actually compete in an international marketplace for those artists because we are at that level. And so that's another piece of, if you will, human capital. I was interested in Clara's model because I guess we're kind of in that position of having a true structural deficit, and we're a model that deploys people but also sells ticket, which has got to be pretty much the worst possible combination, no? I'm pretty sure. I guess I see myself in the midst of a heroic turnaround, and I think the important things to remember, and I don't think I'll go the way Earl did into the details of all the issues, but I can certainly answer our questions. But some things to remember from my perspective is, first of all, not to choose not to define oneself in terms of the short-term challenges, but to really look ahead to that structure that needs to happen over the long term, including the capital piece of it, and just go after that relentlessly and have the discipline not to be distracted. I hesitated in my case study of even bringing up the nutcracker dislocation issue, which represented about a 20% of total budget loss for this year. But I even within the organization have really avoided treating that as the symptom, if you will, because many of the things that we need to do for long-term stability needed to happen anyway, with or without that issue. And so while it is informs some of our decisions at the moment, and certainly have created, I would say, quite a speed bump in our travels, it was important to really know where we're going and how we're going to get there. I think the other thing is to identify the right scale in the firmament of where your program lives. In our case, it's competition for the entertainment dollar, which means we're competing with the Red Sox, we're competing with Clear Channel, we're competing with Lion King, we're competing with American Idol on television, we're probably competing with casinos for all I know, everything. And so you have to find your place on that firmament of entertainment options where you can live comfortably. And I can honestly tell you that Boston Ballet has not found that niche yet. I can also tell you that I have found that for another organization, and once you can identify your place or your market share, it can be remarkably stable. My prior life was at the National Ballet of Canada, and 3 years after coming to Boston, some of the, if you will, market share niches that I identified are still the same. And so once you find it, it can be found. And I guess really just to close, I think, in periods of prior to my arrival, there was quite a leadership turmoil period. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing is that in those periods, it is really the only thing that investors, donors will focus on are programs. And so I think there's always a problem in that if only the programmatic side is being invested in, then the other side is not being similarly taken care of. So I guess one of the things that we will be needing to do is a little bit like the Steppenwolf Theater, is recalibrating our earned versus contributed and investing in the contributed side. I actually added 10 to my development department, so very, very similar. Actually, their case study would probably mirror mine pretty well. And I guess just to conclude, I guess as a dance company, as a performing arts organization, our mission still is artistic expression, and really taking you and everyone else in Boston along with on our travels, if you will, in our belief that the arts do enrich people's lives and that they are an important part of what we do. And so we're committed to that, and hopefully over time we'll address many of these capital issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
I'm not, as you may see, from the black church. I am from the church of very strict fathers, which means if he said good morning to you and you didn't say good morning back, trust me, you knew about it. I was talking to George this morning, and he said, it may not be the most exciting topic we're talking about today. And I said, yeah, but if you don't have cash and you have problems financially, it gets exciting very, very quickly. So in that sense, I think there's a other side to it that's incredibly exciting. And before I start and tell you a little bit about Europe and some of the challenges we've faced, I'd really like to thank both Clara and George, because it's really their work and work of folks like the Boston Foundation that informs practitioners like ourselves. In fact, I'd credit George for a lot of the strides we've made in thinking about how to look at the next 5 years with frameworks that we just didn't have to hand a few years ago. So that's incredibly important work for folks who are practicing and don't have time to do all the research that may be required. I'm the founder of an organization called Year Up. Europe's mission is to provide low-income 18 to 24-year-olds with the education, the experiences, and the guidance that they need to make positive transitions into livable wage careers in post-secondary education. Unfortunately, it's a need that's growing probably exponentially in our society. We have 33% of Latinos and about 19% of African Americans dropping out of high school today. They are our fastest growing groups in this country. We will live in a minority country by the year 2035. And you couple that with 8 out of 10 new jobs in America demand some form of post-secondary education, you have a massive opportunity divide. So it's one we're very focused on fixing as an organization and contributing to it being resolved. How we try to resolve that is we have a program that's 1 year in length that has 6 months of intensive training in technical, professional, and communication skills. We then place students into a 6-month paid apprenticeship with one of about 40 major corporations here in Greater Boston and now in Providence and Washington. The students earn through a partnership with Cambridge College. I see Dr. Cardoso here today from Cambridge College. They earn college credit the entire time they're with us. They earn 18 college credits. They also earn a stipend of about $11,000 over the course of the year to enable them to study during the day, which for many students who are from low-income backgrounds, studying during the day is not an option. Eating during the day is preferable in that case. It's a very high support, high expectation model. Students have mentors, they have advisors. We're all trained in case management as staff members. It's also very strict. So students have a very high set of expectations they must adhere to continue in the program. And so far more than 85, 86% do adhere to those over the course of the year and are successful in the program. We started in 2001 with our first class, which was 22 students. I had a budget of about $750,000. This year, 2005, will service about 210 students with now sites in Boston, Cambridge, Providence, and just opening up in Washington with a budget of about $5.6 million. So it's grown pretty quickly over the past 4 years, and I'm probably most pleased to say that 85% of the folks who graduated from our program now earn on average $30,000 a year, which is a livable wage in a very expensive city like Boston, and more than half of those students continue to get their Bachelor of Arts degree, although the majority on a part-time night basis, which is really that combination of working and learning that many low-income individuals need today to get that BA. Our gulp, George, if you want to answer what a gulp is, when we first said, gee, we want to start this program and touch 10,000 young adults. And then you said, well, how much does it cost? Well, let's see, $11,000 in stipend and probably $12,000 of training, so that's what, $23,000, $24,000. Or if you multiply $24,000 times 10,000 students, you gulp. You have $240 million. You think, how
a year?
No, not a year. Well, that's 10,000 a year. We thought cumulatively to start we'll touch 10,000 and worry about going forward. But it will get to that point, hopefully. So the gulp was this thing requires a lot of capital in order to grow the program. So you're growing quickly, and you have an expensive program. We will never be the lowest cost provider of what we do. We get great results, but they cost money. So the first challenge is how in goodness name are you going to finance this type of organization going forward, given it's growing quickly and it's expensive. And so we thought about the challenge as having two real stages. It was kind of 0 to 5 years and then 5 to 10 years. How would you finance this organization? In the early days, we didn't have a big development staff. In fact, we still today only have 2.5 people in development, including myself. So we didn't have a lot of development resources to start with. And we said, okay, the things we have to do financially, we've got to provide businesses with something they will pay us for and treat those businesses just like any other supplier in the for-profit sector. In our case, we provide businesses with pre-trained, pre-screened, entry-level, talented young adults. And guess what? Businesses will pay for that. We'll earn $2.2 million this year by providing Fidelity, Putnam, Bain Capital, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with entry-level talent, which they would have to go to temporary agencies or other folks to get that type of talent. So we knew we had to develop a source of revenue to start to fund this program. So you could say, give these apprenticeships away, sell them for $6 an hour. We say, no, we're going to sell them at a fair market value to the biggest companies who have resources to pay for them, and in so doing, cover 40 to 45% of our operating costs through this effectively business of providing corporations with talent to go forward. We also said, okay, in the donations, in the funding we receive, we do not have the ability in the first 5 years to cultivate a lot of donors. So we focused on high-value, low-volume donors in the first 5 years because we did not have the bandwidth to really cultivate the numbers of relationships we'd need to fuel the organization. We made the model very performance-driven. So we asked people for a lot of money, and we also said, if we don't hit results, take our money away. Very simply, if we don't hit these clear outcomes, we do not deserve your money, you may take it away. I think that gave people confidence to give us the type of funding we required in the early years to get the model going and building up. We also said we don't want any government money for the first 5 years. We felt that could be constricting or constraining too early on, where we yet didn't know what we did well and what we didn't do well and how our model would be refined. So we really consciously stayed away from the government for the first 5 years. When you look at any program like ours across country, they're 40 to 75% funded by the government on average. So that got us through the first 5 years, and it was, I guess all stories are told better in hindsight than looking forward, but at least got us to a point where we could be stable enough to look at the next 5 years, which is fundamentally different in terms of financial strategy. So we really now focused most heavily on separating operating revenue from growth capital and seeing the business we're in, which is we provide training services to students. They're consumed by students, but we're going to ask someone else to be the customer and pay for those. So it's effectively a business saying, you know, Kevin McCall, say, Kevin, would you pay for training services? Your son Ethan is not going to consume them. A young adult in Boston is going to consume them. But you're still paying for services. You should expect great quality. You should expect results. And if we do a good job, I would expect you may want to buy more of those services in years to come. That has to be priced in such a way that it covers your fully loaded marginal cost of providing that service to the student. And as George would push us to do, is a little bit more than that to start to contribute to overhead and some of your growth capital. But to really look at this hard as a business, how much does it cost to educate a student? How do you pay for it in such a way that's sustainable and scalable going forward over the next 5 years? And for us, that's focusing heavily on a scholars program, or what we call the Year Up Scholars, where individuals can help to finance students to go through our program. You could have 200 people financing that, rather than today our donor base is considerably smaller than that in terms of who we rely on for capital. So that was a major difference over the next 5 years. The two other things we're doing are pursuing public funding pretty aggressively. So we'll spend about $300,000 in lobbyists over the next 3 years. So far, we've earned more than that in public funding. Would expect to earn probably tenfold that in public funding. But it's 3 years of investment to get to that point with the public and the government where they will support you. So we made a 3-year bet, $300,000, earmark that to say, can the government play a role in financing this type of organization? We're probably a third of the way through that, and so far the indications are the government likes the model. It generates tax revenue for the government because they're putting in a little bit of money. Student does well, generates $30,000 of income, and pays taxes back to the government. So it's hit a nerve with bipartisan groups in the government is something that could be a good way forward. And the last thing we're doing is going to individual growth capital providers and saying, to get a site up and running for us, to launch Providence, to launch Washington, to launch New York, is going to cost about $1.2 million. $250,000 of startup capital, then probably $900,000 of subsidy over the first 3 years until they become sustainable on their own 2 feet, and they're able to sell what they need to locally. So going to groups of people and saying, we're going to open 3 sites, 4 sites over the next 5 years, we need to raise about $5 million in a private placement. Basically, why not fund all of our growth capital up front? We will tell you what we are going to do with it, and you have an exit path at the end of this, because we now have operating revenue to cover the cost of running the program. So you're really separating those 2 types of funding and going after different funders who may want to either buy a training service or provide you with capacity to actually grow that business and then get it to a point where it's sustainable on its own 2 feet. I guess that's the strategy. In 5 years' time, if we achieve it, then that probably will be much more interesting than saying what we're going to do today. But I think it's really through George and others that we're trying to focus on how do you grow an organization like this and make it sustainable and scalable on a financial basis. Maybe I'll stop there and pass on. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, listening to my colleagues here, I have a lot of thoughts, but as I was thinking about my presentation, I thought, well, really the title of my presentation is The Tale of Scale, Overcoming Vision Block and Financial Conservatism. Because basically, Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corp. Has been seen as a financially healthy organization, and we're being kind of challenged to leverage our financial health to bump up our mission. So it's kind of a little bit different approach, but it doesn't mean, however, that we are, there financially. I mean, we still have a lot of work. We're a work in progress, and we still have many financial needs, and looking at that triangle that, Claire told us about. And we also have to think about, from a mission perspective, how much risk are we willing to take? What is our tolerance for risk? But before I give you a little bit about Codman Square in D.C., I just want to comment on, some of what my colleagues said in terms of, I'm a parent first. I have 3 children, all girls under the age of 13. And so I always, when I hear about different programs, think about, gee, how can I get my kid into that? Or that would be great. So I want to say, with Earl's presentation, I've heard great things about the Bell Foundation. I've never been able to get my kids in there for various reasons, but, it was the reputation that was the reason why I wanted in there. I have had my children in Boston Ballet's Taking Steps program, which they absolutely loved. And I'm trying to figure out how to get my kids to benefit from the type of services that Year Up offers in the future. So unfortunately, we don't make the income guidelines for many of the programs, but the goals of the program is just extremely exciting. So I wanted to throw that parent piece in there. In terms of Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, also known as the NDC, just in terms of the work that we do, we are a community development corporation which has a mission of enhancing the quality of life for all residents in Codman Square through fostering the stabilization of the community. So we do this mainly through real estate development, economic development, community planning, and community building. Just one of the things that I'm very proud about in being affiliated with Codman Square in D.C. and the CDCs in general in Boston is that, the communities, the inner city communities in particular, have been completely transformed as a result, I think, largely of the work that the CDCs have done. So if you go down any of the major thoroughfares, like in Dorchester, Columbia Road, or Blue Hill Ave, Washington Street, I've lived in the neighborhood for a long time, and I remember driving through the intersection of Washington Street and Blue Hill Ave in Dorchester back in the early 80s, and literally, in my car, being afraid. And I grew up in Roxbury, but being afraid because it was like the dawn of the dead. There were all these people on the corners and, literally kind of strung out, looking ominous. And a few years later, because of the work of groups like Codman Square in D.C., Urban Edge, other CDCs, and the support of a lot of the funders, those thoroughfares and those intersections have been totally transformed. You go through them now, they're some of the nicest looking intersections in the city. They're very pretty vibrant. So that's the passion and the thrill of the work that we do. We have developed a little over 700 units of affordable housing in our 24 history. Things that excite me about the work that we do also include things like, seeing literally a junkyard, 120,000 square feet junkyard that's been sitting in the neighborhood for 20, 30 years, leaking out toxins, et cetera, be cleaned up and converted into a neighborhood, where people live, where kids out in playgrounds as part of those housing developments that we've created, playing. I mean, it's the real stuff of life that we do in terms of creating communities that I'm very proud of. And seeing a daycare center, a basement in one of our buildings, that's dank and musty, literally being converted into a beautiful, vibrant, light-filled daycare center, and kids that are playing in it. So this is basically the work of Codman Square in D.C. But at the same time, while we have a strong history of doing community development with an emphasis on bricks and mortar, we really, needed to look at our mission and use the resources that we have to kind of bump that mission up another notch. And so by that, as an example, we just finished the strategic planning process this year, but 4 or 5 years ago in 2000, when we had done the initial plan, when I became executive director, the first plan, strategic plan that we did, our boards had a long-term goal of by 2005, we will have intervened in the real estate market by creating and preserving affordable housing and commercial development and mitigate the causes of displacement. And I said, oh, wow. Wow, that's a lofty goal. How do I interpret it now? It means moving to scale. I mean, community development corporations like ours are being challenged constantly these days by funders and others to move to scale. Where Codman Square in D.C. in the past 10 years or so, 5-10 years, has been doing site-by-site real estate development, meaning disparate, 30,000 square feet here, 100,000 square feet there. Important work, but smaller scale, 50 units here, 75 units there, of rental and homeownership housing. We're now in an environment where we're being challenged to go to scale. And so what that means for me now in terms of that long-term goal that the board set out is, how do we move to scale from a real estate development perspective? How do we go from a micro perspective to a block-by-block kind of perspective, meaning looking at acquiring entire blocks? So the impetus for this kind of relationship between, the programs and mission, the capital, and all those, and the other parts of the triangle, really is the goal that the board set out. But also, it has to do a lot with the work that we're doing around the Fairmount Line Collaborative. We are in a collaborative with 3 other community development corporations and some other local nonprofits to convert a commuter rail line, the Fairmount commuter rail line, from a commuter rail line that basically goes from Hyde Park and speeds effectively right through our neighborhoods to South Station into more of a rapid transit line. So we're working on transit equity issues, and the CDCs in the collaborative are really keen on looking at issues related to development, real estate development along the line, with an emphasis on transit-oriented development. So these are things that have kind of challenged us in terms of moving to scale, looking at the macro block by block development, looking at transit-oriented development, looking at planning as opposed to kind of doing the disparate site development in a way that we haven't really done in a while. I mean, we actually started off back as I was putting this piece together, I went and thought again about our history, and it surprised me that in the earliest days, we did actually do this kind of scale development. Our first couple of developments were raising a couple of blocks and putting about 100 units of homeownership housing into an area where there was, blight. And then one of our other developments was looking at about an 8-block radius, what's called the BHP2s, which is about 350 units of affordable housing development. But since those earlier days, we've kind of moved into more of a conservative pattern of doing site-by-site development. We're now challenged with having to go to scale. We're involved now with the goals that the board has set out. We're involved with this collaborative around the Fairmount line that really is pushing us to go to scale. And so the challenges are, how do we grow our capacity to go to scale? Particularly in a time of diminishing public and philanthropic resources for affordable housing and for the nonprofit sector in general. To stay on course over the past 2 years or so, we've dipped slightly into our operating reserves. That's a gulp. We haven't repaid some of those operating reserves. It's not unusual for us to dip into our reserves, but we usually have a strategy and resources available to almost immediately repay those reserves. We've experienced a downturn in our net assets. I think mainly, excuse me for all the accounting people that are in here, but I think it was mainly just an accounting issue. I don't think it was indicative of our real financial health. But all those issues combined, it's going to scale means we'll have to expand staff training capacity as we need to get more sophisticated around acquisitions, negotiations, transit-oriented development strategies, et cetera. It's also going to require us, as we go to scale, to look at growing our capital base for real estate projects. So we happen to be fairly financially secure in certain ways. I mean, we have a real estate development fund, which was initially capitalized 10 years or so ago at about $1 million. We have a operating reserve, which is probably a 4.5 or so month operating reserve, not enough. But we've been told by some of our national funders, intermediaries, that we're too conservative financially, that we need to leverage. Now, this was a big one, for us in our board to hear a funder tell us you're too conservative financially. So that's why I entitled this talk, A Tale of Scale, Overcoming Vision Block and Financial Conservatism. Because, we have had to really take a look at those comments and say, okay, well, there may be some truth to that. We need to look at how to better leverage the resources that we have in-house. But also, we recognize that we don't have enough resources. There's also this fear, frankly, of going to scale and what that means in terms of the additional resources that we're going to need. So increasingly also we're going to have to compete in the private market as we go to scale. And everybody knows the real estate market is extremely hot right now. In the past, we've relied fairly heavily on free or lower cost public land. A lot of that land in our neighborhood right now is scattered site, not aggregate site, and so we are now in a position of having to assemble both public and private land as we go to scale. And as we start assembling this land, we also need capital. Although we have some of our own capital, it's not nearly enough to move to scale. The need to move to scale is putting a lot of pressure on our operational base as we need more real estate development staff, as we need more fundraising staff to help us just keep the operations part of the ledger going. So we need more capital on both levels, and we also are a little concerned about how our aggressive acquisition strategies might impact market values in our neighborhood. I mean, we don't want to create an inflated market, but at the same time, we feel like if we don't intervene, as the board asked us to back when we were doing strategic planning in the real estate market, that someone else is going to intervene in ways that will not be beneficial to our constituents. So, it's a mission tug of war between, acquiring the real estate for responsive community development, and then also perhaps creating a market that we didn't intend necessarily to create in our very neighborhood, not necessarily to the benefit of our neighborhood. So the issue is finding, one of my other colleagues talked about finding our niche. We have to find our niche in terms of our risk scale. How far do we want to go? Our board essentially has decided to go ahead and take a leap of faith to some extent and say, let's move forward and do some acquisitions. But at the same time, one of the things that we know we have to do in terms of, operating like a business is grow our operating base. We have to bring on more staff, particularly in the fundraising area. We have to bring on more staff in the real estate development side. We also know in terms of attracting capital for our real estate development projects that Advocacy, frankly, is one of the ways that we're trying to attract more capital through particularly the Fairmount Line Collaborative that we have going on. We've, over the past year or so, in working with our sister CDCs and other nonprofits through that collaborative, we've been able to generate a lot of energy and interest in this Boston-wide approach to, or at least certain sections of Boston-wide approach. This is a 9-mile corridor that goes from Hyde Park down to South Station, and all these neighborhoods along the line are working together. That's generated a lot of interest in on the funding side that we think will pay off in terms of the capital aspects of real estate development. So basically, we are, and we're also using our board-designated development fund to, put more resources out there as we move toward acquisitions and moving to scale. We're taking a leap of faith. We're trying to look at business operations as we go to scale. We're moving forward with our strategy, and we're looking forward to working with folks like the Nonprofit Finance Fund to help us analyze all the different pieces of it. But it's a challenging time for us, and the mission issues are just as kind of on the edge as the financial issues for us. So, thank you.
Thank you, Gail, and all for marvelous examples of, it seems like every place you look there's a tension to be managed between the finances of an organization and the mission of the organization. One of the patterns that strikes me as I listen to all of you leaders, and indeed you are leaders of cherished institutions in our community, is this notion of working backwards from a sustainable enhancement of some type. It seems that each one of you has a vision of an organization that has a different capacity to do good, and it's a vision that also has sustainability associated with it. That's part of the vision, which is maybe the business, the underlying business current. What's so difficult, I think, among many things, but one of the very difficult aspects of working backwards, if you will, from sustainable enhancement is that it's very, very rare that when you make a structural change to what it is you do, that it works the first time. And indeed, usually when you're trying to make structural change in an organization, it's a destabilizing thing as opposed to an immediate improvement in the financial aspects or even programmatic aspects of an organization. At first, you get it wrong. So it takes great courage, of course, to embark upon the travels, as I think Valerie put it, of working backwards from some sustainably enhanced vision, if along the way you're going to trip and perhaps fall on your face for a time. And I would argue that really is the role of capital. The role of capital is to provide some forgiving space, if you will, while an organization is undergoing a transformation to its next version. And Clara had that beautiful depiction. I mean, beautiful to a nerdy banker type, I guess, but this absolutely beautiful depiction of the before, during, and after, which is when managing change in an organization, it's initially destabilizing, and then there is some new equilibrium that needs to be reached. It was terrific to hear in each of your stories. I think there are elements of that. If I could ask a question or two, and I'm just going to ask one question because then I think it'd be much better to have the members of the audience ask the question. But if we could just very quickly go down the line, what would you like to see change in the field? Because we all, as we work in our nonprofit organizations, inhabit an environment which is very much shaped by not only funders but other institutions and by other nonprofits, by ways that we work together and so forth. I'd love to hear from each of you what changes to the field would you love to see that would help you reach that vision of a sustainably enhanced organization. And any thoughts?
I think that when I read Ms. Miller's piece before this session, I think in some of what she said this morning, too, about, I think we need to coalesce more as nonprofits around better informing funders about what it is that, how they can really invest in our organizations. I mean, the operating side, for example, is one that is always always left out of the ledger. Funding new programs, which means new costs, additional costs. It has no bearing on your base usually when you do a new program, but the base is still very much needed, is there, and needs to be funded. So I think we need to coalesce as nonprofits to really provide information and perhaps more education to funders about what our needs are and how to invest long term to support the important missions that we all have.
I think the two things I would say is, one, there's been a real big movement recently towards organization capacity building, and so to continue that movement to allow us to build the organizations that will enable us to deliver quality and deliver our mission. And then the second is, alongside of that, continue to focus us on performance, but also have an appreciation for the time it takes to actually get this right.
I think time is where I would put an emphasis a little bit. Partially all of us getting together and educating funders and donors and the community at large that when you change a scale and try to address sustainability, not just program, that one does trip up along the way. Certainly in Boston Ballet, the evolution from being unhealthily overly reliant on earned revenue and box office almost totally to a more contributed income, more normalized nonprofit model meant addressing some of the inefficiencies and excess capacity in the performance schedule, which then impacted audiences because we inconvenienced audiences. And so, just the recognition that as we move to a more stable model and have to make adjustments, not just for sustainability, but also to react to our external market. That we won't get it right away, or more to the point, we need the time to get there. And certainly, I don't know about the infrastructure of my colleagues here, but certainly at Boston Ballet, 65 to 70% of the total budget is people. And so these are not easy shifts to make, and they always involve people. And I guess it's just recognizing that again, that long term, keeping that long term in mind and not getting swayed by the short term.
I'd probably ask funders to maybe reconsider why things have to be measured in years. Everything is a yearly grant or a yearly submission, and often projects are maybe 22 months or 36 months. You think about a venture capitalist, when they put money into an organization, they often don't say, well, this is a one-year investment. It's an investment to get to a set of outcomes or a set of goals, which may be measured slightly longer than a year. So maybe a shift from a yearly focus to a project focus where it was appropriate might be good. And also I think the concept of, in Year Up, we're building something that hopefully will serve 600, 700 students. So it's imagine like building an automobile manufacturing plant to make 600 cars, yet we do not know who's going to buy those cars. Who are the funders of those cars who will buy them? They won't be the consumers, the people who ride in the car as a student. So to look out through multi-year investments as more of a natural course of what an organization needs to grow, I think would be very, very helpful for many of us. In so doing, I think we have to then make sure that our funding is tied to results. So if we do not hit the results we have, and I agree we need time, but look, hold us to a 20% up or down. We do 20% better or worse than what we tell you. You should have some sort of challenge or problem with that. So hold us accountable, but stay with us longer so that we can achieve some of the things that will get us to a greater impact.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's open questions up to the audience. And Clara, would you like to come up, and you can take this seat, and I'll just go over there. Oh, is there one in the middle? Okay, terrific. Great. Any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Thanks. Wow. Okay. I guess one of the things that I'm responding to as I sit here is dollar amounts and adding 12 development staff. I'd venture a guess that some of us don't have 12 people on the board, never mind the staff. So when I think about balancing and infrastructure, all of those lessons that I think are true, Part of what we're struggling with is being in the shadow, frankly, of a funding climate in Boston that gives to big groups. And so you're mid-size and you're struggling and you're saying, okay, how do I make the nut? And I wonder if you guys can talk about some of the lessons that, speaking of scale, like reverse scale, down to what's core to financial management and mission-driven management that's not about millions and gazillions of dollars for us folks, A. And B, maybe comment about it's great that there's an investment in organizational infrastructure, but I can get $19,000 for strategic planning, and I can't get $2,000 to pay for the teacher salaries. So in terms of funding climate, that's another thing I feel like I'm up against is the funders who say, oh, we think it's a great idea for everyone to invest in their organizational infrastructure, and I say, I think it's a great idea to keep the lights on. Yeah. So I wonder if you guys could talk about that.
I mean, yeah. I wanted to comment on that. I feel like I'm the small person up here in terms of budget because my budget is $1.4 million, where that might be still a big budget, a really big budget for you. I appreciate the comment, but compared to my colleagues, it's a very small budget. We have many assets, but budgetarily, we're not that big. One of the things that, in terms of kind of scale, it is an issue for us. I mean, this whole issue of, do you go to scale because you're expected to go to scale, or can small and mid-size be beautiful, And we've kind of made some conscious decisions to move to scale for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that one of our founding board members, when I consulted with him a few years back about fundraising, said to me, which still I keep in the back of my mind as a backup, is focus on your core work. We've kind of grown and diversified our lines of business from our original work over the past 10, 15 years in particular, where we started off with a focus in housing development. Our name actually was Codman Square Housing Development Corporation, and we went about in 1993 and changed to Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. And there was a lot of good reasons for that change, but that also meant diversification of product, diversification of lines of business, and diversification of focus. So where we used to do just affordable housing development, we now do economic development, more community building, more community planning. And our founding board member said, think about, as you're entering into stressful times, maybe going back to your core activity, which is housing development. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking about the reverse, that as you need to, you scale back down. I think, frankly, from our perspective, it would be a shame to do that given the many needs the community has, but from a financial reality perspective, that could happen. And I echo what you said about, just keeping the lights on, meeting payroll. I mean, I think that is part of what my comment is, to challenge funders to, help us with the base operational costs. And I also, get very frustrated with, frankly, with funders expecting us to do volume for tiny money. So we expect you to develop 500 units of housing. Here's $50,000. Come on, let's get with it. I mean, it's not real. That's just not a realistic scenario. So I think we should, again, be educating funders in the way that you're putting forth about this type of thing.
I feel your pain. I mean, I don't think, but I think that one thing to remember about our sector is that the largest organizations, Harvard and the American Red Cross, are small in relationship to commercial organizations, because we have to build 2 or 3 businesses to kind of subsidize our core as we scale. So the choice of whether you grow or not is a hugely important choice to make, and I think we all run by it because we all assume that the more we do, the better it is. I thought Valerie's point about niche and about where you belong and how big you should be. Growing is not always the best way to be effective. This is a quick digression, but there are people who say, well, Harvard could be described as an extremely profitable investment management business, i.e. the endowment, with a very profitable real estate management company, and, oh, by the way, an extraordinary scaled fundraising machine, which probably, it costs 0.0001 cent to raise $1 from very wealthy people, by and large. With a small school attached, oh, by the way, which after 300 years continues to be unprofitable. And I'm being silly, but just because you haven't scaled is not necessarily a bad thing. I think the second point about the compulsion among government funders, donors, whoever, to restrict cash as it's put into organizations is something that we all could improve on. I don't think anybody here doubts it. And I think often what happens is that there's confusion between results and restrictions. In other words, you think, well, I've had funders say, well, we can't measure the results of our money going into this organization unless we put restrictions on it, which, of course, is not correct. You can go to you can say to a funder, here's what we're going to do, essentially invest in our plan. And what we, as a group, and I would say that funders and nonprofits, we're all in the same boat, need to come up with a better set of rules that helps us actually invest affirmatively in the whole organization and its whole vision, rather than little pieces of it. So I agree with you on that.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. I'm Rob Kaufman from the McAuliffe Regional Charter Public School. I want to thank you guys. It was really fantastic presentations. It resonated with me on so many levels. Boston Foundation and Nonprofit Finance Fund. You're our lender for some capital improvements, and your staff have your attitude because they've been extremely responsive and understanding of our needs. So thank you for that. I have a question about the business model and how much our boards and management ought to tolerate deficits. It sounds like, as you've said, Harvard is still unprofitable, that we're selling widgets essentially for less than what they cost us to make them. But yet lenders seem less tolerant of nonprofits that operate at a loss than they do of businesses that sometimes take years to break into the black. So if I go into my board meeting and I say, listen, it's okay that we're operating at a deficit. All successful nonprofits do this to build their program, to produce quality and build credibility in the community before it turns around. And then this idea of, capital and using it for forgiveness, which just sounds so wonderful. But, how do you raise money for forgiveness? So what's an appropriate, reasonable, prudent business model where we can say it's okay to operate in the red for this amount of time?
You want to take that?
Well, I can offer a little bit of possibly a path to answering that question, because really what you're asking in your case, you're saying, what does it take to run a school? I think that should be the question. It doesn't matter if it's a charter school or a public school or Phillips Exeter. And so one of the things we can do is to open ourselves up to the idea that we can compare ourselves to peers, not because we want to find another stick to beat ourselves to death with, because we have a terrible habit of doing that, I think, in our sector, but so that we can learn from each other, and so we can answer the question that you're posing. Because I think that there are points at which you can say, here's a spectrum. There's a whole range of schools, and, let's say Andover. Well, we won't pick on any in particular, but, it's a boarding school, so it might not be comparable to your school. But when they're getting donations or they're putting together their capital structure, what does that look like? What does their fundraising business need to do as they scale per child coming in? Because in most cases, if you just look at the numbers, you see that every child that walks into a very well-funded, high-end private school has a $10,000 to $15,000 price on his or her head when they walk in the door every single year. And that's not even talking about the capital that has to be raised. So it's a well-scaled subsidy business that is very, very specific about how they subsidize those operations, that's scaled in every financially solvent private school there is, and it doesn't matter, or public school where the taxpayers are turned to as the funding base. So I think we look at that. Excuse me?
Are there benchmarks for different core businesses in the nonprofit sector?
No, but that's one of our ambitions.
The answer,
and just instructive benchmarks. Not, I think you can go too far with that stuff.
all the way in the back, sir.
Thank you. I'm Mosik Hakopian from Urban Edge. We do the kind of work Cadman Square does, and we have the sort of opposite culture. We not only are risk tolerant, we embrace risk, and we have no cash. I want to suggest that to some extent, there's some common themes across the nonprofits, but I think maybe folks who are doing real estate development, there's some specific differences that are important to recognize. Later today, there'll be an announcement about a development in Jackson Square, which is of a $200 million scale. And we've spent the last 10 years and probably about $2 million to get to this point. And it's $2 million of everybody else's money because we don't have enough of it. So part of what I want to suggest is, while I agree with everything you said, is that part of our job as nonprofits to be part of a network that invests in the things we all agree should be done. It's not as much an investment of capital and a return on that capital. It's a way of a community investing in itself. And there's a certain amount of investment of effort and dollars to be made, and part of our job is to figure out how to be part of that network, not go over the edge, but just sort of be as close to the margin as possible, because that's how you push the system to do what it doesn't want to do. So I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. And you might call that risk tolerance, or you might call that pushing the envelope, but there is that discomfort zone that we have to be in. Otherwise, I don't think we're serving either the mission or the business of the organization and the sector.
Well said.
Thank you. Ma'am.
One of the things I'm struck by is that, it seems to me that a number of the nonprofits like Earl's and maybe Gerald's eventually scale by moving to new geographic regions. And I'm sure you wouldn't say every child in Boston is done, so time to move to D.C. Mm-hmm. And so my question is whether that might be something that in the old paradigm we used to call chasing the dollars. And I was wondering if Ms. Miller could comment on that, because it strikes me that you see a lot of nonprofits with sort of that operate from a business model using that, but how could the Boston Ballet do that, or how could Codman Square NDC do that? I don't see a way for them to do that, and does that mean that they somehow get left behind because the new paradigm doesn't provide an opportunity to demonstrate the success of one's program by moving to new geographic regions, for instance?
I would be happy to comment. I can tell you that one of the things about my interest in this world is that NFF and we're a nonprofit ourselves, and we've scaled, and virtually every one of the bad mistakes that I talk about we've made. And all of the idea of, I think that if I had any kind of business training or brain, we wouldn't have become national in scope, or at least we might have gone about it in a very different way. So I think that we have both the distinction and the burden of running headlong into things that we don't think about beforehand. That happens to be one of our great strengths, as the gentleman in the rear pointed out, but we have to recover from them for years and years. I don't think that geographic expansion, or expansion of any kind, sad to say, is financially a good thing or it's sort of a sustainability, unless you sort of say, okay, we're going to expand and then the funders have to rescue us because we're so special, which is one fundraising strategy. So I think that that finding one's niche, understanding how scale and mission fit together and what your business model is and how you can sustain it is the key.
Yeah. I was going to echo that slightly. When the sick nonprofit patient rolls into the emergency room, one of the most common causes of the problem was overextension, often into new geographies. Maybe in the interest of chasing money, but more often than not, there are tremendous stresses and strains associated with landing someplace new and making all the mistakes that happen when you're in someplace new. And Earl, I certainly remember many conversations about, on the one hand, so deeply wanting to serve scholars in where they lived around the country, on the one hand, versus, on the other hand, being concerned about destabilizing Bell on the home front. But maybe you have a comment or two.
I mean, the way we entered Regions, it really wasn't strategic. It was have a few classmates in New York. Let's open the New York office. That really was the extent of it. Now we look at it a little bit differently, where it's not just niche, but it's market. And so if our business model is relying on supplemental education services, SES vouchers, we'll compare the right markets that are most receptive to what we have to offer. So in Boston, a Boston-New York quick comparison, Boston has 5,000 children eligible for SES. New York has 300,000 children eligible for SES vouchers. Boston is highly competitive as a school system, so the district actually has about 60% of the vouchers. New York does not provide SES services, so it's open and makes it the environment welcoming for both private and nonprofit providers. And so I could go on in the comparisons, but now as we're looking at kind of markets, we would love to grow within Boston. The SES and the funding environment here isn't going to allow us to. So if we say, gosh, we could push really hard and do everything, try to get the superintendent on our side, and then maybe serve another 1,000 children, well, but when we have New York City saying, come on, you're welcome. I mean, that's how all of our growth last year, really most of it happened in New York City. We went from having 250 children last year to having 3,200 children this year. And so we're going to continue to leverage the markets that allow us to do what we want to do, which is serve our children.
Just as a footnote, how Boston Ballet has expanded, if you will, in the past is that the school, the aforementioned largest school in North America, has 3 locations in total, one in Boston, one in Newton, and one down in Norwell. And that's always a question for us is it was already there when I got there, and so now it's a matter of evaluating those locations and see if expansion is a good idea. The other way that a ballet company serves other markets, of course, is through touring, and that's something Boston Ballet has not done, but probably should think about, because it's really one of the ways that your own community becomes aware of your excellence. In some ways, I think this company is better recognized around the world than it is here in the city, and one of the ways to address that is to go to Paris and get a really great review, which is not something we have invested in as yet, but that is something that actually impacts your own community and how you're perceived, and the support that you can receive at home, and that's one of the strategic reasons why it's done.
Okay. Is there another comment down there?
Just say that the Boston Foundation often has asked us, why do you have to go to other cities? Why not just focus on Boston? Which is a fair question. I think for every nonprofit, it's working back from your intended impact. What is your long-term intended impact? And does that necessitate that you have to demonstrate a model in other communities, which may have wonderful leadership development benefits, which we've seen already, may have wonderful learning opportunities. Eric Schwartz from Citizen Schools would say that it's quality through growth. So the growth of the organization has helped them to learn about how to run a better quality program, as they've learned a lot in different communities and also developed leaders in different communities. But I think from our perspective, because we always from day one had the intended impact of being a national impact, we knew that it at some point had to go beyond Boston to prove it wasn't a fluke. And also the model will be harder to implement outside of your home turf, so to speak. So proving it in other difficult or other markets would, at least for me personally, show that it had the legs to potentially have a wider impact across a greater number of geographies.
I think we've got time for one more question. Sir, yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Dennis Fishman. I'm at the Community Action Agency of Somerville, which is an anti-poverty organization. And some of what we do is human services, which has, I've heard the analogy to producing widgets at a loss per each item, and I recognize that for our human services kinds of programs. The whole other area is more in the area of social change. Our mission is not only to help people get out of poverty, but to address and, when possible, eliminate the social causes that lead to and perpetuate poverty. In that respect, I think we're less like a manufacturer and more like a banker. We put people together who have ways of working together to achieve that outcome. A lot of our time is spent in networking, in fostering collaboration. As a director of planning, I do a lot of research that is available to the community, and that helps move policy on these issues. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel can help us think about how to connect money to mission when your mission is social change.
Sure, I might take a shot at that. One distinction that I'm very fond of is, and I've got a little essay that I put together there, is the distinction between builders and buyers. And I would say that any philanthropist or any government funder in human services is making an investment into the community, in the sense that it's work done today or money spent today, actions taken today, which are designed to give rise to future improvement in the community, either in the forms of the trajectories of people's lives improving or in other forms across all types of social purpose organizations. So that one form of investment that we make is, you might call it programmatic investment. We do the work of working with the community, and the return on that investment is usually a future payoff of some type. And sometimes it'll be 20 years later, 40 years later. But there's a second type of investment which is profoundly different and I think is sometimes lost. And that's investment into organizations that are designed to make it possible for others to invest into the community. So the investment into an organization is much more akin to what the business world would call equity investments. That's building an organization which either will or will not reach some sustainable level of enhancement. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bigger, by the way. And with some chagrin, this thing is titled growth capital. It should say enhancement capital. But there's a difference between putting money into an organization which either will or will not become sustainably enhanced as an organization, versus using that organization to invest into society over time. And maybe that distinction can help folks kind of clarify that question. I'm afraid that we are out of time. Geeta, did you want to? Well, should we just finish it off with any closing remarks? Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much. It's marvelous to be able to talk about this topic with the folks who really are out there making the world change, as opposed to just looking in the mirror and thinking about nerdy financial things. Earl.
I really have no final comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl.
I think earlier we said that the nonprofit sector needs a banker, and of course we do have it in the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and certainly having some place to go to talk about these timing issues and these long-term sustainable projects that take time and sometimes can cause problems even just while you're trying to pursue them I think has been great for Boston Ballet and some of us on this panel, and so it's quite exciting for me to meet Clara.
Well, I'm thrilled to be in this room and in the presence of the people on this panel. We in the nonprofit sector do three very distinctive things. We probably do more things, but from an economic point of view, we provide services that everybody agrees in our society are pretty critical to people who can't pay for them. That's one thing. Second thing we do is that we provide things that, because of qualitative considerations, will never meet commercial standards. And that might be, you can't buy Stradivarius violins in bulk. If you scale the size of a kindergarten class to 200, it would probably be profitable. But who would want, the quality might decline. And the third thing we do is that we do things for which there is no known return at all, commercial return. And basic research for science, conceptual art, advocacy, all kinds of, you don't know that you're going to get a return. And that's why the business side is so extraordinarily difficult. And that's what we're trying to invent an economy for, that both an economy and practice that acknowledges that that's the nature of who and what we are. So I think that there are limits in the existing business model, but I don't think that we should limit our aspiration.
I just certainly want to thank George and Clara and the other panelists, and also just compliment Clara on being able to actually find and generate a graph that showed Delta Airlines with some sort of positive upward trend. It was absolutely remarkable in the airline industry.
A theater looks better by comparison.
Well, I just want to thank the Boston Foundation and all the panelists here. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And also, I want to just end on aspirations. I think, taking a leap of faith, taking calculated risks and moving forward so we can meet our mission is really what it's all about as far as I'm concerned.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.